They said she was cursed, unfit to bear life, unworthy of love. Her own parents turned her away beneath a cold western sky, leaving her to wander the wilderness with nothing but her shame. But when she stumbled upon a lonely lumberjack raising 4 children on the edge of nowhere, something in his tired eyes met the emptiness in hers. 2 broken souls, bound by loss, found a reason to begin again. She was cast out for what she couldn't give, yet in that cabin of laughter and sawdust, she discovered what family truly meant. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The rain fell like judgment from heaven, washing the dust of the frontier town into muddy rivers that crawled down Main Street, carrying whispers with them. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her family's home, her father's ranch that had stood 3 generations strong, and felt the weight of every eye on her. Inside, her mother sat at the table, face buried in trembling hands, her sobs quiet but sharp as broken glass. Her father stood near the hearth, his silhouette hard against the orange glow of the fire, jaw clenched tight as he spoke, words that would haunt her forever. "You've shamed this family long enough," he said, voice low, measured, cruelly calm. "A woman who can't bear children has no place under my roof." Evelyn tried to speak, her voice small, fragile, a plea caught between sorrow and disbelief. "Papa, please, I've done nothing wrong. You can't cast me out for what the Lord has denied." But her father's eyes, cold and steady, didn't waver. "It ain't about what the Lord denied, it's about what you've taken from us." The neighbors talk. The pastor shakes his head. "You've cursed this name, Evelyn." Her mother cried harder then, a single broken whisper escaping her lips. "Go, child," before he says more he can't take back. Evelyn's fingers shook as she gathered her few things into a small cloth satchel, her mother's locket, a worn Bible, and a change of clothes. The walls seemed to close around her, heavy with the scent of smoke and regret. When she stepped out into the storm, lightning cracked across the sky, revealing the faces of neighbors peering from their windows, pity in some eyes, satisfaction in others. She walked down the muddy path, her boots sinking deep with each step, the hem of her dress soaked and clinging. Every raindrop felt like the world reminding her of what she wasn't: a wife, a mother, a daughter worth keeping. Behind her, the sound of the door slamming shut was final, like a coffin lid sealing. She didn't look back at first, afraid that if she did, she'd crumble right there in the mud. But something made her stop at the edge of the property, the old fence her father built when she was a girl. She turned and looked once more at the faint glow of lantern light in the window. The place where she learned to braid her hair, bake bread, dream of a life that would never come. The rain blurred it all into streaks of gold and shadow. She whispered to no one, "I'll find my way," though her heart trembled at the lie. Then she turned toward the wilderness, the open plain stretching into darkness. Thunder rolled, wind howled through the trees, and Evelyn walked on each step, pulling her further from the life she'd known, deeper into the unknown that would soon test every piece of who she was and who she was meant to become. The days bled into one another, a blur of gray skies and aching feet as Evelyn trudged through the vast, untamed wilderness, her once fine dress torn to ribbons and her shoes long abandoned to the mud and stones of the road. The forest loomed around her, ancient, endless, whispering with the wind as though the trees themselves gossiped about her misfortune. At night she built small fires, barely more than embers, the smoke curling up into a sky heavy with stars she hadn't noticed before, each one distant and cold but stubbornly shining, much like her own will to live. Her stomach growled in protest with every sunrise, and she learned to chew on bitter roots, to sip rainwater from leaves, to trap the warmth of her shawl close as if it were love itself. On the 4th night, she dreamed of her mother's face, soft, tear-streaked, begging her father for mercy, and woke to the sound of wolves howling somewhere far off, their cries echoing like the ghosts of the family she'd lost. She thought then that she might die out here, nameless, forgotten, swallowed by the land. Yet even as her hands trembled and her lips cracked from cold, a strange peace crept into her bones. She began to notice beauty in small things, the way the morning fog rose from the ground like spirits dancing, the sound of a creek singing low through the rocks, the courage it took for a bird to call into the vast silence. On the 7th day, as her strength waned, She came across an old wagon road half consumed by moss and vines. She followed it, unsure why. But some instinct, some whisper of purpose urged her on. Her breath came ragged, each step heavier than the last. But the sight of distant smoke rising through the trees filled her with fragile hope. She thought it might be another traveler, a camp, maybe even a town. But as she neared, the path grew wilder. And she realized it wasn't smoke, it was sawdust and mist from the work of man. The scent of pine thick in the air. Her heart beat faster, though she could not explain why. That night, too weak to continue, she curled beneath the shelter of a fallen log. The forest creaked and sighed around her. But she was beyond fear now, her thoughts drifting between dream and memory. She whispered a prayer not for rescue, but for a reason to keep walking. And somewhere, far beyond the trees, the sound of an axe striking wood echoed faintly, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of fate calling her forward, though she didn't know it yet. Her wandering was leading her not toward death, but toward a life she never imagined, a life built not from what she had lost, but from what waited patiently to be found. The forest was still that morning, the kind of quiet that comes before either a miracle or an ending. Frost clung to the edges of fallen leaves, and Evelyn's breath hung like smoke in the chill air as she stumbled through the underbrush, her limbs trembling from exhaustion and hunger. Her body had long since surrendered to the cold, but her mind, though weary and ragged, refused to die. She had not eaten for 2 days, surviving on melted snow and stubborn will. Her vision blurred with every step, her senses fading until the world seemed distant and dreamlike. Then came the sound, steady, rhythmic, unnatural to the wild. Thud. Pause. Thud. The unmistakable cadence of an axe biting into wood. Hope, sharp and startling, jolted her heart awake. She turned toward it, pushing through the trees with trembling arms, each swing of the axe growing louder, closer, more alive. When she finally broke through the thicket, she saw him, a lone figure framed in pale morning light, his coat rough and worn, his back broad as the pines around him. The man's movements were deliberate, heavy with strength, but burdened with sorrow. Each swing of his axe both work and penance. Piles of split logs surrounded him, the air thick with the scent of sap and smoke. Evelyn opened her mouth to call out, but only a hoarse whisper escaped her cracked lips. The man stopped mid-swing, head tilting toward the sound. Slowly, he turned. His face was lined and wind-burned, his beard flecked with gray, and his eyes hard and steady as river stones narrowed as he took her in. For a long moment, neither spoke. He looked at her like a man seeing a ghost, thin, pale, barely standing, her dress torn and muddied, hair tangled with leaves. Then, without a word, he dropped the axe into the snow and stepped toward her. Evelyn tried to back away, afraid he might be some outlaw or worse, but her knees gave out, the world spinning into darkness. When she came to, warmth surrounded her, the crackle of fire, the smell of pine smoke, the faint hum of a child's laughter somewhere near. She lay on a rough cot covered in a wool blanket, her body trembling beneath the sudden comfort. The same man sat nearby, sharpening his knife by the firelight, his face unreadable but not unkind. "You're safe," he said finally, voice deep and measured, as if each word carried weight. "Name's Samuel. You can rest here till you're strong enough to move on." Evelyn tried to thank him, but tears came instead, silent and hot against her cheeks. She noticed small details, then the half-carved toys on the table, the children's coats hung neatly by the door, the soft murmur of little voices in the next room. A boy peeked out shyly, no older than 10, clutching a wooden horse. Samuel gave him a look, gentle but firm, and the child disappeared again. "My kids," he said, as if answering her unspoken question. "Their ma's been gone 3 winters now." His voice caught just slightly, but he masked it with a deep breath. Evelyn understood without asking. The grief in his eyes mirrored her own. She watched the firelight dance across his face, softening the hard lines, revealing a weariness not of the body but of the soul. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice fragile but sincere. He only nodded, tossing another log into the flames. "Ain't no need for thanks," he muttered. "The world's cruel enough. No sense in adding to it." For the first time in weeks, Evelyn closed her eyes and felt something she thought she'd lost forever: safety. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the world in quiet white, as though heaven itself wished to erase the past and begin again. In that small cabin at the edge of nowhere, two broken lives, unaware of what the days ahead would bring, had just crossed paths, one seeking purpose, the other haunted by loss, and neither knew that this chance encounter, born in the heart of the wilderness, would change the course of both their stories forever. The morning light crept through the cracks in the shutters, painting thin stripes of gold across the cabin's wooden floor as Evelyn awoke to the faint sounds of life stirring within. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the warmth of the wool blanket, the scent of fresh bread, the hush of wind outside. It all felt like a dream too kind to last. Then the low murmur of Samuel's voice reached her, deep and steady, instructing the children in their chores, and the truth settled in. She was still in his home, alive, fed, and sheltered. Rising from the cot, she took in the small but sturdy space, the walls lined with shelves of tools and jars, the old rocking chair by the hearth, and above it, a single photograph in a cracked frame. A woman's face, soft and smiling, looked out from behind glass, a ghost of love and loss that seemed to anchor the whole room. The late Mrs. Harlow, she guessed. It explained the silence that clung to the air, the way Samuel moved through the house like a man walking on the edge of memory. The children kept their distance, four small shadows bound by curiosity and caution. The oldest, a boy of 12 named Matthew, watched her with guarded suspicion. His eyes were his father's, steady, gray, unflinching. The twins, Lucy and Owen, whispered to each other from behind the table, their giggles fading whenever she turned their way. And then there was little Clara, the youngest, no more than 5, who stared at Evelyn as though trying to place her in some half-remembered dream. Evelyn offered a smile, gentle and uncertain, but none of them spoke. When Samuel entered, carrying a bucket of water from the well, the air shifted. "Breakfast," he said simply, placing the bucket down. He gestured toward the pot simmering over the fire, a stew that smelled of venison and herbs. Evelyn murmured a quiet thanks and took a seat, careful not to overstep. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft clatter of spoons and the faint pop of the hearth fire. Samuel didn't look at her much, but when he did, it was with a mixture of gratitude and something unspoken, an ache that seemed older than grief itself. Afterward, when she offered to wash the dishes, he hesitated, as if unused to help. "You don't owe me that," he said. "You're a guest here." Evelyn shook her head softly. "A guest eats for a day. A helper earns her keep." The faintest flicker of approval touched his face before he turned back to his workbench. So she began to make herself useful. She swept the floors, patched torn clothes, and mended a curtain that had hung half-tattered for months. With each small act, the house seemed to breathe again, losing a little of its weight. The children watched her quietly, their mistrust softening as they saw her hum softly while she worked, the same lullaby their mother once sang. By evening, the fire burned brighter, the air warmer. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching her brush ashes from the hearth. "You've done more in a day than I have in months," he said quietly. Evelyn met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was human. He turned away before she could answer, his shadow lingering in the firelight. But Evelyn saw what he couldn't hide. A man still bound by his past, and yet, perhaps, willing to let a stranger's kindness begin to loosen its hold. The weeks that followed passed with the rhythm of soft mornings and long, quiet evenings, and though no one spoke of it, the air in Samuel's cabin began to change. The silence that had once felt like mourning now carried the hum of small, ordinary sounds. Evelyn's gentle singing as she swept the floor, the crack of the fire, the rustle of children's feet across the wooden boards. Little Clara was the first to bridge the distance between stranger and family. One afternoon, Evelyn found the child outside near the well, gathering a handful of wildflowers, daisies, and fireweed, their colors pale against the gray dusk. "These are for you," Clara said shyly, holding them out with both hands. Evelyn knelt, her eyes misting as she accepted the fragile bouquet, her heart aching at the simple kindness. The next day, the twins, Lucy and Owen, began following her around the cabin yard, offering to carry buckets or stack kindling, their laughter a reminder of what the home had long been missing. Even Matthew, proud and solemn, began to thaw. He watched Evelyn repair one of his father's old shirts one evening and finally asked, hesitant but sincere, "You been out here long, Miss Eve?" The name startled her at first, so simple, so tenderly given. She smiled softly, not long enough to forget what kindness feels like. From that moment, a quiet trust began to form between them, not through words but through shared work, shared silence, and shared loss. Each day, Evelyn found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of their lives, kneading dough beside the hearth, brushing Clara's hair before bed, teaching Lucy how to hem a dress. She never asked for more than what was freely offered, and that humility, that gentleness, began to fill the spaces grief had hollowed out. Samuel noticed, though he said little. He'd watch her sometimes from the doorway as she worked, her hair glinting in the firelight, her face calm and steady as she tended to his children. Something in him, long buried beneath guilt and exhaustion, began to stir. He tried to fight it, to remind himself that his heart had no business waking again, but the sound of his children's laughter made resistance feel foolish. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the pines, Evelyn baked her first loaf of bread in their home. The smell drifted through the cabin, rich and comforting, pulling the children to the table before she could even call them. "You'll spoil us, Miss Eve," Samuel said from his corner, his tone half gruff, half grateful. Evelyn smiled. "A home deserves a little sweetness." The twins giggled as she sliced the bread. Clara clapped her hands, and for the first time in years, laughter filled every corner of the house, bouncing off the walls like sunlight after a storm. Samuel sat back in his chair, his rough hands folded, and watched as his children leaned close to this woman who had once been a stranger. He felt the weight in his chest ease, the old ache shifting into something softer. For a long time, he had believed joy belonged only to the past, buried with his wife beneath the birch tree behind the house. But as he watched Evelyn's eyes glimmer in the firelight, heard her soft laughter mingle with the children's, he understood something simple and profound. Grief might linger, but life, stubborn and beautiful, would always find a way to bloom again. The weeks that followed passed with the rhythm of soft mornings and long, quiet evenings, and though no one spoke of it, the air in Samuel's cabin began to change. The silence that had once felt like mourning now carried the hum of small, ordinary sounds. Evelyn's gentle singing as she swept the floor, the crack of the fire, the rustle of children's feet across the wooden boards. Little Clara was the first to bridge the distance between stranger and family. One afternoon, Evelyn found the child outside near the well, gathering a handful of wildflowers, daisies, and fireweed, their colors pale against the gray dusk. "These are for you," Clara said shyly, holding them out with both hands. Evelyn knelt, her eyes misting as she accepted the fragile bouquet, her heart aching at the simple kindness. The next day, the twins, Lucy and Owen, began following her around the cabin yard, offering to carry buckets or stack kindling, their laughter a reminder of what the home had long been missing. Even Matthew, proud and solemn, began to thaw. He watched Evelyn repair one of his father's old shirts one evening and finally asked, hesitant but sincere, "You been out here long, Miss Eve?" The name startled her at first, so simple, so tenderly given. She smiled softly, not long enough to forget what kindness feels like. From that moment, a quiet trust began to form between them, not through words but through shared work, shared silence, and shared loss. Each day, Evelyn found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of their lives, kneading dough beside the hearth, brushing Clara's hair before bed, teaching Lucy how to hem a dress. She never asked for more than what was freely offered, and that humility, that gentleness, began to fill the spaces grief had hollowed out. Samuel noticed, though he said little. He'd watch her sometimes from the doorway as she worked, her hair glinting in the firelight, her face calm and steady as she tended to his children. Something in him, long buried beneath guilt and exhaustion, began to stir. He tried to fight it, to remind himself that his heart had no business waking again, but the sound of his children's laughter made resistance feel foolish. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the pines, Evelyn baked her first loaf of bread in their home. The smell drifted through the cabin, rich and comforting, pulling the children to the table before she could even call them. "You'll spoil us, Miss Eve," Samuel said from his corner, his tone half gruff, half grateful. Evelyn smiled. A home deserves a little sweetness. The twins giggled as she sliced the bread. Clara clapped her hands, and for the first time in years, laughter filled every corner of the house, bouncing off the walls like sunlight after a storm. Samuel sat back in his chair, his rough hands folded, and watched as his children leaned close to this woman who had once been a stranger. He felt the weight in his chest ease, the old ache shifting into something softer. For a long time, he had believed joy belonged only to the past, buried with his wife beneath the birch tree behind the house. But as he watched Evelyn's eyes glimmer in the firelight, heard her soft laughter mingle with the children's, he understood something simple and profound. Grief might linger, but life, stubborn and beautiful, would always find a way to bloom again. The sky broke open without warning, turning afternoon into chaos as black clouds rolled over the valley and the wind howled through the trees with a voice like the dead. Rain came down in sheets, cold and merciless, drenching the ground and washing away every trace of the path. Evelyn had not gone far when the storm struck just beyond the ridge, where the woods thickened, and the trail began to disappear beneath mud and pine needles. She clutched her satchel to her chest, the fabric soaked through, her shawl whipping in the gale as thunder cracked overhead. Her heart felt heavier than the sky, torn between the need to leave and the desperate wish to stay. Every step forward was agony, her boots sinking deep in the mire, but she pressed on, whispering to herself through the roar of wind, "You've done enough harm. Go." Something in her gut screamed otherwise. Back at the cabin, Samuel had discovered her absence just as the first drops began to fall. He stood in the doorway, calling her name, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. Panic took hold as Lucy burst in, crying that the twins had gone to gather firewood near the stream before the sky turned dark. "They're still out there, Pa," she shouted, her face streaked with rain and tears. Samuel's stomach dropped like stone. Without hesitation, he grabbed his lantern, yanked on his coat, and plunged into the storm. The forest greeted him with madness, the sound of trees creaking, branches snapping, wind tearing through the canopy like a beast unleashed. His voice echoed, raw and desperate. "Owen, Lucy, Clara." Each shout was met with silence, each flash of lightning revealing nothing but endless rain and shadow. Then, faintly through the downpour, he heard another voice, a woman's, calling the same names. "Clara, Owen." It was her. Evelyn. Against every reason she was there, stumbling through the storm, skirts heavy with water, hair plastered to her face, her arms raised as she shouted into the wind. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he caught sight of her through the haze, her figure glowing faintly with each flash of lightning, fragile yet defiant, like a soul refusing to be lost. "Evelyn," he roared, running toward her. She turned at the sound, relief flooding her pale features. "They went this way," she cried, pointing toward a grove of bent pines. Together they fought their way through the mud, slipping, calling, their voices hoarse and nearly drowned by thunder. At last, beneath a fallen tree near the stream, they found the children, three small shapes huddled together, shaking but alive. Evelyn fell to her knees, pulling Clara into her arms, tears mixing with rain. Samuel dropped beside her, checking the twins, wrapping them in his coat. For a moment, the world fell away. All that remained was breath, warmth, and gratitude. He looked at Evelyn then, truly looked, and saw not the woman gossip had named, but the one who had risked her life for his family. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, voice breaking between relief and regret. Evelyn met his eyes, her lips trembling but sure. "I couldn't leave them," she whispered. "I couldn't leave you." The wind howled around them, but in that moment, something steadier rose between them, an understanding, raw and undeniable. As they carried the children home through the storm, side by side, neither spoke another word, for both knew what words could not express, that love, like fire, sometimes begins in the fiercest rain. The storm had spent its fury by the time they reached the cabin, leaving behind a world washed raw and silent, the forest dripping with the heavy scent of rain and pine. Inside, Samuel stoked the fire back to life, his hands shaking from exhaustion and something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. The children were asleep, bundled in blankets by the hearth. Their breathing slow and even, small faces still pink from the cold. Evelyn sat nearby, her dress still damp, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the flames as if afraid they might go out. For a long while, neither spoke. The thunder rolled distantly through the valley, and the fire cracked softly between them, filling the cabin with its warm, flickering breath. Finally, Samuel broke the silence, his voice low, worn thin by the night. "I thought I'd lost them," he said, staring into the fire. "And when I saw you out there calling their names like they were your own, I didn't know what to feel." Evelyn looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let them die, Samuel. I couldn't let you hurt the way I've hurt." He nodded slowly, jaw tightening as he reached for the poker, prodding at the embers as though he could shape his thoughts into sense. "You saved my children, Evelyn," he said finally, his voice cracking. "But you also scared me." She frowned, unsure. But before she could speak, he continued, "Not because of who you are, but because of what I could lose if I let you stay." The words hung between them like smoke, fragile and true. Evelyn's breath caught, her heart twisting. "I know what the traitor said," she murmured. "I heard it. And I understand. A man like you can't afford whispers." He turned then, meeting her gaze for the first time since the storm began. His eyes, usually hard and guarded, were wet with the reflection of firelight. "You think I give a damn what they say?" he asked quietly. "I've lived through worse than gossip, but when I lost Mary—" His voice faltered. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "When she died, something in me died too. I built this house, raised these kids, kept this land going, but I swore I'd never let myself care again. Then you came, and suddenly the silence didn't hurt as much. The laughter came back. You made me remember what life felt like. And that terrifies me." Evelyn felt the tears before she could stop them, her chest tightening as she whispered, "Samuel, I wasn't running from shame when I left my family. I was running from the truth they couldn't bear. I can't have children. They called me cursed, useless. They threw me out like I was broken beyond fixing." Her voice trembled, the confession unraveling years of silence. "That's why I never meant to stay long. I didn't want to be a burden again." For a moment, Samuel said nothing. Then he set the poker aside and reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers. "You've already given them more than I ever could," he said softly. "You've given them peace." Evelyn stared into his eyes, the firelight painting both their faces in gold and shadow, and for the first time in years, she saw no pity, only gratitude, fierce and real. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the cabin glowed with quiet warmth. And in that stillness, two broken hearts, long bound by fear and grief, finally found the courage to begin healing together. Spring crept slowly into the valley, and with it came renewal not sudden or grand, but steady and sure, the way morning light slips into the corners of a long dark room. The storm had left behind more than broken branches and flooded paths. It had stripped away the last walls that fear had built between Evelyn and the family she had come to love. Weeks turned to months, and the harsh winter gave way to gentle warmth, to soil soft enough for planting. Evelyn took to the earth with quiet joy, her hands once made for sowing and mending, now finding purpose in the dirt. Each seed she pressed into the ground felt like a promise, a whisper of life returning. She showed the children how to plant beans in neat rows, how to tend the herbs by the window, how to listen to the land as if it were alive. They followed her eagerly, laughing, their small hands muddy and proud. Even Samuel, who once rose before dawn and returned home too weary to speak, began to linger longer near the garden fence, watching her with a tenderness he no longer tried to hide. The cabin, once dim and heavy with silence, now brimmed with life. The smell of bread baking filled the rooms. The soft chatter of the children echoed through the halls. Evelyn taught Clara to read by firelight, helped Lucy sew her first dress, and listened patiently as Owen and Matthew argued about who could split logs faster. She moved through the home not as a guest but as its heartbeat, her presence stitching together what time and grief had torn apart. Samuel noticed the difference in small ways, the laughter that lingered even after the day's work was done, the way the children raced to meet him at the door, their faces alight. And every evening, when the sun sank behind the ridge and the sky blazed orange and violet, he would catch Evelyn on the porch, gazing at the horizon with quiet wonder, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He'd stand beside her without a word, their silence now one of peace, not pain. In town, the gossip that once nipped at their heels began to fade, replaced by something else entirely. Folks saw the change in Samuel, the way his shoulders no longer carried invisible weight, how he spoke softer when buying supplies, even how he smiled when someone mentioned the woman up at the cabin. Whispers of scandal turned into murmurs of admiration. Stories of how the lumberjack and the barren woman built something finer than most could dream, a home, forged not by blood, but by choice. By midsummer, the garden bloomed wild with color, and the air hummed with bees and laughter. On Sundays, they shared supper by lantern light, the children's voices filling the twilight as Samuel's deep chuckle joined theirs. Evelyn often caught herself watching them, her heart full to bursting, realizing that love need not come from the body to belong to the soul. One evening, as the family gathered by the fire, Clara climbed into her lap and whispered sleepily, "Mama Eve, tell the story again, the one where you found us." The name struck deep and gentle all at once, a gift she hadn't dared to hope for. Tears welled in her eyes as she kissed the child's brow, her voice trembling with warmth. "Once upon a storm," she began, smiling through her tears, "I found a home. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, not as a warning this time, but as a song of peace, proof that the barren woman had bloomed after all. The first light of dawn broke softly over the ridge, spilling gold through the thinning mist and painting the forest in hues of quiet fire. The world seemed to hold its breath in that fragile hour between night and day, when everything felt both new and eternal. Evelyn sat on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, a steaming cup cradled between her palms. The scent of pine and wet earth lingered in the air after a night's light rain, and a faint chill kissed her cheeks, carrying with it the crisp promise of another day. The cabin behind her was still, its inhabitants asleep, their breathing steady, the rhythm of peace she'd fought so long to find. She watched as the sunlight crept across the valley, illuminating the garden she had tended with care, the fields Samuel had worked with his sons, the smoke rising lazily from the woodpile. All of it, this quiet life carved from wilderness and sorrow, felt like a miracle born not of luck, but of endurance. Her thoughts drifted to the woman she once was, frightened, cast out, walking through the wilderness with nothing but pain and prayer. She barely recognized that version of herself now. The ache in her chest, once heavy with shame, had softened into gratitude. She was no longer the barren outcast her parents had scorned, but the keeper of laughter, the mender of hearts. The door creaked softly, pulling her from her thoughts. Samuel stepped out, his boots whispering against the wooden boards, his hair tousled, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He paused behind her, looking out at the spreading dawn, and for a moment, he simply stood there, as if words might disturb the sacred stillness between them. Then, gently, he laid a hand on her shoulder, his touch rough yet reverent. "Didn't expect to find you up before the sun," he said, his voice warm and low. Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured. "Didn't want to miss this." He followed her, gaze the pale pink light spilling over the pines, the soft shimmer of dew on the grass. "Never thought I'd find Grace again," he whispered, almost to himself. There was no bitterness in his tone now, only awe, as if he still couldn't quite believe what life had given him after taking so much away. Evelyn turned her head toward him, her expression tender, the firelight of dawn reflected in her eyes. "You didn't find it," she said softly. "You built it." The words hung in the air between them, simple and true, carrying the weight of everything they had. Endured the grief, the loneliness, the long nights of silence and sorrow that had somehow led them here. Samuel's arm slipped around her shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body against the morning chill. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the world awaken together. Behind them, the cabin stirred with the faint sounds of life, the clatter of dishes, the children's sleepy murmurs, the spark of a new fire being kindled. But for that moment, the world belonged to just them. The man who had lost everything and learned to love again. and the woman who thought herself empty and became the heart of a home. The sun rose higher, flooding the valley in gold, and the scene held like a promise that redemption does not come from what is found in the light, but from what survives the dark to meet it.